I've always found Impressionism to be very unimpressive. It always felt to me like an empty bourgeois pastime that looks good on postcards, but nothing more. This is probably because it actually was just that at the time, which I'll get into. I knew it was one of the main established art genres within recent memory, often found in museums, and that people loved it, but I always felt like it was totally vapid and lacking something valuable that would truly make it good art. But why? Is it that it's too bland, too pastel, blue, white, and floaty, with no real weight or drama? Nothing that captivates and holds you? That's part of the reason, but there's a lot more to get into when it comes to Impressionism. When I look at this art, I don't feel anything. This is because the way it's done is a false reproduction of the actual artistic process. What it's trying to do is to use a blurry, sketchy technique in order to show a certain aspect of experience, to strike a feeling and sensation in the viewer. But what's weird is that they all look the same. It's often not authentic to the individual painter or to the moment and context of the painting itself. Just a bad, half-minded technique, ruining every picture's potential for true development and spiritual reality. The reason it doesn't feel authentic is because it doesn't convey how anyone would actually apprehend that thing or experience in the physical or emotional world. Typically, artists study nature and they learn how to draw it with more and more accuracy. And once they're proficient at that, their own manner of drawing starts to come out, which ultimately leads to their own individual style. This is how Goethe formulated the artist's process in a short essay which I read aloud in an earlier video. Style is meant to become an individualized take on the world, coming from the artist, how he prefers to see it, what he wants to highlight, and how exactly he bends reality towards a more spiritual interpretation of it. His aesthetic changes are exactly what demonstrates this new reality. As the legendary art historian Alois Riegel said, art is man's competition with nature. Making it blurry and badly done for no reason isn't conveying anything since it's false. That style hasn't come about through this genuine artistic and intellectual process. It's simply lazily added on as an afterthought, sketchy. It's really the undoing of style rather than the creation of it, although the artists at the time might have thought otherwise. The real meaning and thought behind it is that reality itself is to be distrusted, because Europe was becoming disenchanted with realistic depictions which are actually long-standing products of culture, a very focused long string developed over millennia. Impressionism is like an artificial mood. These sorts of moods are toxic in art, in my opinion. Wyndham Lewis wrote about this in his book called The Demon of Progress in the Arts, which inspired me to come to this full understanding. Just like a filter on a photo, Impressionism, as it tries to be known as a true artistic style, is really only a colored cloud that obscures the real truth, whatever raw feeling or form or vision you actually want to convey, which has to do with the key elements of art, form, and content. These elements of art are the fundamental ones. Decorative aspects or effects are secondary. This is actually key to understanding the nature of art. In Lewis's book, he made fun of Picasso's blue period and how that became a fad amongst artists. He wrote, "The pictures of the more authentic masters of the past did not suddenly develop curious rashes. But the mercurial masters of the budding century had to give the student mass a new sensation every few years, or even every few months, by going red or by going blue." What he meant is that art cannot come about by forced technical moods being imposed upon them. It has to come from within, with all the elements of art, composition, content, the scene, the meaning. And then the technique, color, light, texture, etc. Everything that fully adds to this truly subjective capturing of a part or vision of reality within the mind of the artist. This new way of doing art by stressing the minor elements of painting as if they can be made to be the major ones can of course be seen in all the succeeding movements, all instigated by technical experimentation alone, within the new modern art, which the Impressionists ended up initiating, to all the successive isms of art, Cubism, Pointillism, Expressionism, etc. All of these movements have one thing in common. One technical aspect of painting, such as light with the Impressionists or perspective for the Cubists, was exaggerated or highlighted as a totalizing view of what art is, which accidentally reduces it to something much less grand, direct, and true to human experience and beauty. Impressionism posits a subtly complex and psychologically advanced thesis about sensory or visual experience, which I think is actually very questionable and can be attacked. The fact that you can choose to make the entire picture unclear or less developed, basically not finishing your art, with zero meaning or goal behind this action, means that the impression it's leaving doesn't even resemble actual impressions or memories of the visual world, because nothing really stays with you. It's so forgettable. Nothing is meant to be deeply remembered for its vital form or artistic importance within the picture. Just vague images of reality. Even in our dreams, we have specific moments or people that are clear and memorable, forms that are articulate, even through a foggy haze. This is because this is how the psyche works. It's obviously meant to truly care about certain elements, to have focus, and to leave other things out of focus. The psyche is responsible for the development of the human soul, of culture, understanding. And to do this, it has to think about things, because the process of thinking means focusing on specific striking aspects, one at a time, within the mind's eye. This reminds me of a quote by Ralph Waldo Emerson, which is similar. It goes, "Not for nothing, one face, one character, one fact makes much impression on him, and another none. This sculpture in the memory is not without pre-established harmony. The eye was placed where one ray should fall, that it might testify of that particular ray." Impressionism pretends to do this, but is actually veering in the complete wrong direction. It's taking the idea of form out of the picture, which I will explain soon. It's cynical, cruel, insulting, and stultifying. Creating something for the mere purpose of resembling something, for no reason, for no conceptual purpose at all. It's not trying to say anything about that thing. It's simply a mood. There is a talented painter named Jean Delville, whose works I really love, who wrote an interesting book and manifesto for idealism in art, something he believed in very deeply. I started reading the book, and after reading what he wrote about the Naturalist and Impressionist movements, I connected some important dots in my mind and was inspired to make this video. I wrote down my full thoughts on Impressionism after reading, which I previously didn't feel like I was allowed to feel deeply. This book is called The New Mission of Art, A Study of Idealism in Art, and these are some segments I want to quote here in this video. This part is from the introduction. He says, "Whether the artist denies it or not, all art, whatever it may be, corresponds to a philosophy. Instinctively or consciously, his method is governed by a certain way of looking at nature and considering man. Naturalism is the assertion of appearances, the faith and instinct in the fecundity of physical life, pure and simple, as Zola declares with such honest simplicity." Now, not only has this naturalism deplorably narrowed the horizon of thought, but as Jean Delville justly observes, quote, "It atrophies the ideal creative powers in the artist's soul by snapping the links that bind it to the spiritual world. Nature is a mingling of enchantment and terror, of ecstasy and awe. The monstrous intermingles with the divine. It is a wonderful chaos of secret splendors. If naturalism in art corresponds to materialistic pantheism in philosophy, Impressionism, its bastard offspring, corresponds to absolute skepticism and tosses between extremes like a wreck drifting upon the sea. Impressionism springs from a dim perception of the insufficiency of naturalism as a source of inspiration. It throws itself into impression to escape from the tyranny of appearances. But lacking intellectual principles, it escapes it only to fall under the tyranny of sensation and extravagant fancy. Sometimes it delights in a brutal realism, turning the painter into a photographer and causing the stage to become nothing more than a cinematograph of life. Sometimes it gets lost in a vague mysticism without form and without idea. Nay more, for hungering after originality, wishing to shock the eye and twist the nerves, it plunges finally into a perverse pursuit of the ugly. Naturalism, realism, impressionism, variations, shades, perversions of the same evil, absence of principles and ideal in the artist. By expelling the ideal from art, the pretended naturalism has misunderstood and profaned nature. Because, considered on its magnificent entirety, nature is an evolution towards beauty as humanity is an ascent towards the ideal. Only one ought to divine the inner meaning of nature and humanity, and not servilely copy their appearance and deformity. Yes, art imitates nature, but it does so in order to complete it. And that is how it happens that nature, insulted and profaned by short-sighted, careless advocates of naturalism, has avenged herself by causing them to mistake ugliness for beauty. This part I just read from Delville restates perfectly the thesis of Alois Riegel, how art is our competition with nature, in the sense that man creates a new reality through art, just like nature has created her own works that we're surrounded by. The idea of art as completing nature goes all the way back to Aristotle, who said, "Art completes what nature cannot bring to finish." The artist gives us knowledge of nature's unrealized ends. The last couple sentences I want to read from the beginning of this book are, "Thanks to this confusion, the better of them have become dangerous madmen, and the others mischievous fools. And as a result, contemporary art has lost its strength, and become overwhelmed by the disorder and anarchy which we see." Impressionism is quite literally the attack on form, which previously defined Western art, leaving us with a feeling of uncertainty. It's not apt to motivate anyone to create anything else, but to be confused and sink into a tumultuous nausea, since something has been unraveled and disheveled in our sense perception. Mistrusting the clear forms of reality is the first step against the search for meaning that lies behind them, which is the germ of what art has been in the West since its art was truly born. Clear vision, harsh lines, Apollonian form, which leads to an exaltation of those forms and of a grand, ideal aesthetic beauty. Impressionism is not very grand. It's simply pretty, like a texture, or a pretty dress, like the ones in their paintings. It is decadence, pointlessness, senselessness, similar in a way to the Rococo, but with less ornament. And in my opinion, even worse than that, as ugly industrial abstraction takes the place of an overabundance of organic forms or energy, and a simple overcrowded prettiness. It is streamlined, modern, natural simplicity trying to simulate the feeling of abundant prettiness and too muchness. So it looks odd to the eye, especially in pointillism, which is the worst. This destruction of form is similar to what Camille Paglia wrote about Art Nouveau. For example, take Monet's paintings. You may look at it and think it's beautiful and organic, but when you actually look closely, you can feel how this melting away, this confusion and overwhelming effect of nature is the direct opposite of the optimistic Greco-Roman culture which tamed and controlled the organic into its stylized motifs, which is the necessary backbone of our art. This kind of style, by contrast, is pure pessimism, a retracting of spirit in real time. It is the antithesis of the beauty of a consciousness of form and of passion. It's a visual pastime that tends to occur around the culture's decadent phase. This leads me to another important point, which is that Impressionism as a concept is not new. The idea of sketchy technique, focusing on visual impressions and optical tricks, instead of the real, linear external forms of physical reality, is a stage in the cycle of culture. Capturing the effect of light and snapshots of movement is an approach to art making which, from the Hellenistic era to Baroque art, is a typical trend of late-stage Western art. It was written about during the Hellenistic era and into Roman art as well. We have some remains of their murals which demonstrate this. Another example is Baroque art, which was totally preoccupied by this need for effects, light, and drama. Sculptures frozen in a specific moment, focusing on the immediate sensation that it provokes in the spectator, and also the sensationalism of emotion and momentary feelings, which the art historian Heinrich Wölfflin formalized into a theory of style. Because of all this, it seems to be a part of civilization as a study, within its life cycle, so it's not completely meaningless as a view. Impressionism does say something about the human soul and our own psychology, and is in a sense artistic, but in the form of its most recent emanation that I'm talking about in this video, the genre that we typically call Impressionism, I think it's extremely weak. Lewis explains how Impressionism was a concealment for the incompetent as a mainstream style, similarly to the modern art of the next century, which Lewis calls Extremism, although Extremism, he says, was 10 times better as a way to hide incompetence, as it's so detached from technical proficiency. At the time, Impressionism was accused of being bad drawing, and I tend to agree. Drawing is the baseline of form, which painting adds to by bringing out color, texture, in other ways, and making it more artful. Lewis himself said in the book, "All too often the painter doesn't care, or doesn't recognize that the drawing is poor. I blame this unconcern for drawing on the Impressionists. Few of them were good draftsmen, and even the few, bewitched by light and color, ultimately sacrificed line for the lazy brushstroke." Lewis said, "Ours is an age, inevitably, of amateurism in the fine arts. There are a countless number of people who are identified as artists, and most of them, even if they have had a little training, remain amateurs." In France, up to this point and into the early 19th century, aspiring artists went to art academies where they were taught how to correctly do art, and there was an annual salon where their work was showcased for the public. The scenes they painted and displayed were from mythology, history, religion, as well as portraits. Classical paintings were done indoors, following tradition, from neoclassicism especially, which was all about studying artifacts and ancient works, such as paintings and sculpture. The Impressionists were a new group of artists who wanted to capture the world around them. They depicted everyday scenes and subjects, landscapes, and people in a naturalistic manner, like a slice of life. They were curious to see how light and movement could be captured in paintings, and because of the transient nature of these things, they painted in quick, unrefined brushstrokes and with brighter colors. And they only mixed the colors on the canvas as they were painting, which was helped by portable paint tools, as opposed to the norm of carefully pre-mixing the required colors before painting. I can interpret this change in this way. Basically, with the subtle collapse of civilization and of a culture which feels increasingly artificial, of the idolized Apollonian forms and objects that had been practiced through tradition, there is a return to nature, the primitive. Culture starts to appear fossilized and dead, pointless, not real, not convincing any longer. Because man's creation, culture, was created as a superior sublimation of nature. And then it became the identity of a people and a way of life that pacifies primal anxiety for psychological safety. With the return to nature and the primitive, this is where movements like naturalism and Impressionism come in. At the start, the 19th century Parisian art establishment was not very impressed or accepting of Impressionism, and the public was initially not swayed by the artists. The new painting style was seen as poorly defined, unfinished, crude, and the subject matter base and unworthy. The critics thought it could not be considered art. They asked, "Is it art when you do not do your best?" Many artists were unable to make money from their art because of their negative reception, and lived and died in poverty. Not painting legendary themes, but rather choosing everyday modern themes was dangerous, as people of that time thought that art should show current society the ancient ideals to strive for, rather than looking directly at the world of today with all that is lacking. Also, many Impressionists chose risky topics to show real life as a protest against the art world. Going back to the Salon, also known as the Exhibition of the Works of Living Artists, it began in what is now the present-day Louvre, which at that time was a royal palace, in 1667. This event became annual in 1737 and was then referred to as the Salon or the Paris Salon, and a jury was added. An artist's career could launch or fail if the jury would accept or reject their submitted work. It underwent many changes in its history. The French Revolution opened it up to foreign artists, and then the Revolution of 1848 liberalized it further, and the amount of refused works was greatly reduced. However, there was a growing feeling of its vital and all-encompassing nature being increasingly unable to keep up with the society and remain both open and discriminating at once. So, after an unusually high number of paintings were rejected one year in 1863, over 2,000 of the over 5,000 paintings that were submitted, Emperor Napoleon III decreed that the public should be allowed to judge these controversial paintings for themselves, which resulted in the Salon des Refusés, or the Salon of the Refused. Most viewers came to simply laugh and ridicule the paintings, but it drew much attention and attracted more visitors than the regular salon. Impressionism is also the psychological birth of the idea of the revolutionary artist within the culture, who is misunderstood and protests the academy, which is really a form of slave morality. The exhibition was entirely devoid of submission and acceptance, as they're rejecting the work of building up an inspiring vision that works in tandem with power to bring everybody up towards the sublime and preserve conscious thought and hierarchies. Within about a decade of their first major exhibitions, the general feeling towards the Impressionists had changed, and they had finally won, especially because of the continuing stylistic developments within the School of Paris, which became more and more extreme, making the originators of the movement seem relatively mild. By the time he was in his 70s, Monet was lionized as an old master of modernism. It became basically an art for the new bourgeoisie, because, as I quote from one of my sources, unable to court the salon's most prestigious patrons, church and state, they embraced liberal ideas of free expression and commerce, appealing to a rising market of bourgeois collectors. Meyer Shapiro said in 1937, "In enjoying realistic pictures of his surroundings as a spectacle of traffic and changing atmospheres, the cultivated rentier was experiencing in its phenomenal aspect that mobility of the environment, the market, and of industry to which he owed his income and his freedom." T.J. Clark said, "Impressionism became very quickly the house style of the haute bourgeoisie, and that its dissolution into the decor of Palm Springs and Park Avenue is well deserved. It tells the truth of this painting's complacence at modernity." The content of the paintings can also be criticized because, in my opinion, without myth as a foundational culture that gives meaning to art, these images of plain modern people going about their lives adds to the empty feeling, because there's nothing to think about or contemplate deeply. It really is just a snapshot of literal reality. Overall, throughout the book, Lewis talks about the breakdown of institutions, of strict traditions and schooling, of the rise of amateur artists and how the art schools and the profession itself began to be a place for people to dump themselves in when they didn't know what they wanted to do. He describes, quote, the institutional unreality and also the costly cultural bluffs inaugurated by the state to conceal the growing absence of culture behind these imposing facades. What he's trying to say is, when institutions start to lose their original purpose and integrity, the state will make big shows of their importance which actually highlight how culturally irrelevant they really are, and how little real culture they possess behind those imposing facades. Which is an idea that Friedrich Nietzsche wrote about and predicted so accurately. The cyclical and gradual lack of legitimacy in modern institutions, the total lack of that spirit which had gone. But where did it go? That's what we're studying right here, and especially on this channel. Although the Impressionists were still a world apart from what was to come after, which was a complete destruction of the past, totally different from the art of the previous century, which we're discussing now, and not really in line with it at all, we can still say that the Impressionist movement led to more intense forms of extremism. Impressionism owed its rise in popularity to the new mercantile public. But after these artists rejected the socially designated centers for art, such as the salon, and experimented with initially unpopular and bizarre art, we can say that the art which came after turned fully against the public and became a purely intellectual, cliquey phenomenon that most of the society could no longer relate to or understand. Paradoxically, by denigrating the so-called elitist institutions of high culture, which were put in place to serve the entire populace, this new art became, and currently still is, a truly elitist social signal of culture for those who are in the know. Lewis writes, extremism is symptomatic of a vacuum, a time in which there is no rationale for visual expression. He says it would be extremely hard to persuade a professional artist to get swept up in artistic adventures that were unpopular or undesirable from the standpoint of the masses of people in a time when art as a profession was still intact. In his chapter called The Glamour of the Extreme, he notes how extremism is often related to vanity, wanting to make a great show, and often childish and immature. He explains how it is a new and cool fashion and possesses inherent dangers that young artists who are starting out in this new world are not well equipped for, since they're lacking all context and throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And of course, the talented don't desire to apply themselves to art anymore when anything goes, and they can no longer compete with classic talents from an age before modernism, and thus most real art in the typical sense will cease to exist. He says, but now, halfway through the 20th century, revolution of a visual kind appears to have become stabilized at a point which is as far as it is possible to go technically without disappearing altogether, without the visual arts committing suicide. It is my belief that we are approaching the point where there will be no visual arts at all, of a serious kind. On the one hand, the advanced gestures, the project foolery will become stabilized. Real whole-time painting of the kind practiced by the old masters will not even pretend to exist any longer. Lewis was proven to be completely correct in all this, and it's turned out that way, in the most extreme sense. At this point, visual art as a medium has essentially died, and nothing is possible anymore. The line has been snapped. It has not carefully progressed in a learned and cultured, innovative way. It has been bastardized, and now we have to start over, if we even can, with some form of the older tradition. He says that nihilism is at the end of the road, past the limit, and that we're heading there. I think it's obvious that we've already passed it. A crucial idea that must be understood here, and in the culture at large, is that in our own perceived need for freedom, we end up really finding ourselves to be less free than before we rejected all limitations. One of his chapters, called When the Painter is Least Free, explains this. The painter is not free when he is following a fashion instead of engaging with the tradition and real content. Lewis writes, "It is a great mistake to think of the painter as free. He could be free, to a certain extent, but he is not. His most harebrained experiments are not wild and daring acts of free adventure. On the contrary, he is probably least free when most eccentric." No, the painter is pushed along paths which are not necessarily his paths, and all artists today submit to a will which is not necessarily theirs. They have their program of work presented to them by a man who is not himself an artist, but a theoretician. He writes, "We have not one manner, as in the past, but dozens of ways of expressing ourselves. It will be obvious from this that the individuality of the artist is the last thing that you are likely to find. Each artist conforms to one or other of the violent orthodoxies of the moment. If you go through the painting galleries of Europe where old masters are hung, arranged according to period, there is a great homogeneity of movements, which continued until Impressionism. Then you get very different painters like Manet and Monet, and within a few decades you reach Van Gogh and Gauguin. Then you'd be surrounded by the Cubists. As you advance from decade to decade, the confusion, the lack of homogeneity would grow. However, this heterogeneity is not an explosion of rugged individualism, but quite the opposite. The personality is surrendered to some small, well-disciplined group. It is always in groups that they advance to the attack upon the obsolete. If the contemporary scene could be confined to any one of these groups, it would seem a very homogeneous period. When you look back at all these movements, the beginning of the isms started around Impressionism, a scientific approach to painting instead of a traditional one. Although he says that the turning point was political, he doesn't credit the political or cultural or social motives of the artists as the reason for their new behavior and their art, as is often wrongfully done, but rather the nature of the development of art itself within its own field. As new ideas entered art and artists wanted to be the champions of the new era and pave the way with their new art, which was supposedly genius and modern in its technical studies and conceptual nature. Yes, the turning point was political. He says, the age of political revolution, beginning with the French Revolution, was followed by the era of perpetual revolution in the arts. Halfway through the last century, the revolutionary zest, the turmoil of schools, the roaring of slogans and watchwords began to assume a crazy intensity. However, what happened within art was not all wrapped into politics at all. It had to do with artists themselves, who really care only about the betterment of their craft. The painters weren't focused on attacking the society, but rather on attacking the previous generation of painters of the school which preceded theirs, and getting caught up in technical self-experimentation. They were experimenting with painting. Lewis calls them technical extremists. He also stresses the Industrial Revolution as the true cause of this vulgarization in society at large, as well as within art movements, rather than the French Revolution and successive events. However, if you study art history, even today, this is often how it's taught. He writes, "The artists of the second half of the 19th century had moved deep into the industrial age, of which the invention of the camera was an integral part. Along with the aftermath of the French Revolution, the Industrial Revolution rapidly resulted in a vulgarization of the whole society from which we still suffer. Therefore, it was an arms race to the end, just like technology, the new master of the 20th century. And this is how Lewis defines extremism. He says, "To promise that something will be contemporary is like an assurance of unfailing youth, and the extremism in the arts is a pathological straining after something which boasts of a spectacular aheadness, looking upon the art in question as a race." In scientific techniques, in the manufacture of any machine, an automobile, an airplane, today more than ever it is a race against the rival manufacturer. Wherever machines are being manufactured, there's the atmosphere of a breathless race, where up-to-dateness is a matter of unremitting urgency. And the art extremist, or more accurately, the promoters of extremism in art, who urge on the painter to more and more extravagance, are behaving as though they mistook the nature of the arts, whose problems are in every way different from those of technology. There must always be competition, all that is natural enough, but a race? A race to put as much distance as possible between himself and what everyone else understands or enjoys? That is terribly silly. Impressionism was simply the first step towards this technical, scientific way of capturing the world. It was a first step against nature and culture. As Delville says, it's a perversion of naturalism, which aims to show the real. But what about the ideal? Shouldn't that be the focus of art? Jean Delville believed in capturing the ideal, a philosophy that sees the divine elements behind nature. Alois Riegel also similarly believed that all art was competition with nature, recreating an imagined, cultured, and human-centered vision of reality. Watch this channel to understand better the nature of art. Thank you so much for your time. Please remember to like and subscribe.